Maybe Smith's life was uneventful, but the times he lived in were not. Indeed, they were tumultuous. The union between England and Scotland forged in 1707 was a bitterly contested affair, but it proved to be a foundation of modern Scottish nationhood, and it set in motion a transformation that made Scotland one of the tiger economies of the 19th century. Union opened the way for Scotland to leave feudalism behind and become what Smith calls a commercial society, based not on personal subordination but on markets and trade. But that process was by no means preordained. After all, in their quest to reclaim power for the Stuart monarchy, which had been dispossessed in 1688, the Jacobites repeatedly rebelled. However, Scotland's 18th century transformation was not merely economic, it was cultural and intellectual as well, and it took the country from the edge to the center of European thought. What is now known as the Scottish Enlightenment included a dazzling array of thinkers in philosophy, the natural sciences, law, history, and literature, as well as political economy, social psychology, and ethics. Smith was born in Kirkcaldy, Scotland on June 5, 1723. He died on July 17, 1719 at Edinburgh, Scotland. Smith was born to a widowed mother. His father, a lawyer and comptroller, died 2 months before he was born. After graduating at the age of 14 from one of Scotland's top secondary schools, Smith entered the University of Glasgow and studied under the influential philosopher Francis Hutcheson. Smith began rising to public recognition in 1748 when he started a series of lectures in Edinburgh on rhetoric, belles lettres, and jurisprudence. Around the same time, he met and began a lifelong friendship with David Hume, who was also a former student of Hutchinson. At the age of 28, Smith became professor of rhetoric and moral philosophy at the University of Glasgow. Then he went to study in 1740 at Balliol College, Oxford. His lectures formed the basis of the theory of moral sentiments, 1759, which was met with great acclaim in Britain and across the continent. Smith reviewed, sometimes on recommendation by Hume, works by D'Alembert, Rousseau, Helvetius, and Voltaire. After working as a professor in Glasgow for some years, he was hired in 1763 to accompany the young Duke of Buccleuch on his tour of the European continent. Smith was able to visit France while serving as a traveling tutor to these young English aristocrats. Smith traveled throughout France and Switzerland, meeting D'Alembert, Voltaire, Rousseau, Helvetius, Morellet, Turgot, Quesnay, and Benjamin Franklin. While not uncritical of his new acquaintances, Smith apparently was impressed with Quesnay and other French physiocrats, who attacked the nobility's extravagance and the government's intervention in the economy as harmful to agricultural productivity and national prosperity. Back in Britain, in 1766, he set about working on what would become his greatest work, The Wealth of Nations, the most important economics books ever written. In 1719, at the age of 67, Smith died a bachelor in Edinburgh, having lived modestly while quietly donating most of his money to charity. One thing is clear: Smith is by far the most influential economist who has ever lived. Virtually every great economist of the past 2 centuries has invoked his name. Every major modern branch of economics, from the so-called neoclassical mainstream to the Austrian and Marxist schools, and the more recent offshoots of institutional, developmental, and behavioral economics, traces its roots back to Smith. He is best known as the author of An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, 1776, one of the most influential books ever written. Why is he important? The old view of economics. In Smith's day, people saw national wealth in terms of a country's stock of gold and silver. Importing goods from abroad was seen as damaging because it meant that this wealth must be given up to pay for them. Exporting goods was seen as good because these precious metals came back. The productivity of free exchange. Smith showed that this vast mercantilist edifice was folly. He argued that in a free exchange, both sides became better off. Quite simply, nobody would trade if they expected to lose from it. The buyer profits just as the seller does. Imports are just as valuable to us as our exports are to others. The Wealth of Nations deeply influenced the politicians of the time and provided the intellectual foundation of the great 19th century era of free trade and economic expansion. Social order based on freedom. Smith had a radical, fresh understanding of how human societies actually work. He realized that social harmony would emerge naturally as human beings struggle to find ways to live and work with each other. Freedom and self-interest need not produce chaos, but as if guided by an invisible hand, order and concord. And as people struck bargains with each other, the nation's resources will be drawn automatically to the ends and purposes that people valued most highly. So a prospering social order did not need to be controlled by kings and ministers. It will grow organically as a product of human nature. It will grow best in an open, competitive marketplace with free exchange and without coercion. The Wealth of Nations was therefore not just a study of economics, but a survey of human social psychology about life, welfare, political institutions, the law, and morality. Psychology of ethics. It was not the Wealth of Nations which first made Smith's reputation, but a book of ethics, the theory of moral sentiments. Once again, Smith looks to social psychology to discover the foundation of human morality. Human beings have a natural sympathy for others that enables them to understand how to moderate their behavior and preserve harmony, and this is the basis of our moral ideas and moral actions. Self-interest and virtue. Some people wonder how the self-interest that drives Smith's economic system can be squared with the sympathy that drives his ethics. Here is his answer. Quote, "How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." End of quote. In other words, human nature is complex. We are self-interested, but we also like to help others too. Smith's books are complementary. They show how self-interest human beings can live together peacefully in a moral sphere and productively in the economy. The Wealth of Nations is no indulgence of economic greed as sometimes caricatured. Self-interest may drive the economy, but that is a force for good, provided there is genuinely open competition and no coercion. And it is the poor that economic and social freedom benefits most. One of the fields in which his work has left a deeper mark is that of international trade. Facing the mercantilist tradition that considered that trade between countries is a zero-sum game in which what one wins necessarily represents the loss of the other, Smith showed that there is not a great difference between this type of trade and normal transactions. If any of us try to sell our products or offer our services where they are more recognized and better paid, and we buy what we need where they offer us better quality and prices, it makes no sense for the rule to be broken for the simple fact that the companies that sell good products at low prices are located in another country. Customs protection, therefore, far from increasing the wealth of a country, hinders its paths to prosperity. After the publication of The Wealth of Nations, Smith soon became a well-known man, and scarcely 2 years has elapsed when he was appointed Commissioner of Customs for Scotland. The charge was certainly somewhat paradoxical for someone who had spent a good part of his life criticizing import bans and tariffs, which is precisely what customs is supposed to do. But even so, it seems that he carried out his position with great dedication and efficiency until his death. Smith's rising public profile secured him a job as the Scotland Commissioner of Customs, where he helped the government enforce laws against smuggling. Why did Smith agree to do this job? It is evident that it was not for economic reasons. Smith had long before obtained a life pension from the Duke of Buccleuch, and he was, moreover, a man of few personal needs. He never married, led a simple life, and devoted a not inconsiderable part of his resources to charitable works. It is more reasonable to think that, although he was critical of customs, our Carter firmly believed that they will always exist, and that managing them efficiently will be a contribution to the economic progress of his country. He had so little faith in the triumph of international free trade in his own country that he went so far as to affirm that he considered it as something as far removed from British reality as the establishment of an ocean or Utopia, referring to Harrington's and Morrow's well-known utopias. His ideas achieved, however, a much greater success than he himself had imagined. 70 years after the publication of The Wealth of Nations, Great Britain abolished the protective laws of agriculture and thus took the great step towards free trade. which will constitute one of the bases of its prosperity in the second half of the 19th century. And the English never ceased to be aware of the debt that they had contracted with that peculiar commissioner.